Hey everyone, Financial Post, as per usual, one of the few outlets that you'll find Canada. And I do suggest, so they don't disappear completely, that those of you who can afford to support these news outlets. You know, I know there's some of them that still kind of straddle that fence or are playing on the opposing team against the people, against the masses, against the population, in favor of the central planners of the globalists. But listen, when any one of them are at least willing to put forth, and I see this on a regular basis, if they're willing to put forth narratives that are in opposition to the central planning types, you need to support these people, all right? Just because we have alternative sources on the internet, yeah, it's having a multi-pronged approach is always a much wiser and better scenario for anybody. Headline: Canada's housing bubble can be traced to Mark Carney and his bias for easy policy. This is from Jared Dillian. Jared Dillian reports for Bloomberg View, Bloomberg News. And yeah, and Mark Carney, in case you're unaware, he was Canada's central banker until he moved over to being the central banker for the Bank of England, right? The England Central Bank. And now we have Stephen Polas. But I've read a little bit already into this article, and some great stuff in here. So I'm just going to get right straight into it so you can hear what this gentleman's got to say. Very insightful. There's a pretty big housing bubble in Canada. By some measures, such as household debt to disposable income, it's even bigger than the one in the U.S. a decade ago. Keep that in mind. If it bursts, which seems pretty likely, and readers should know that I have investments in Canada that stand to benefit if that happens, people are going to look for someone to blame. Let me help. To put what's happening in Canada in context, let's first look at the U.S. following one of the biggest stock market bubbles ever in the early 2000s. The Federal Reserve, led by Chairman Alan Greenspan, feared that a crash-induced loss of confidence could lead to a serious recession or even a depression. And I remember when Greenspan was being, Ron Paul and people were talking about like what Greenspan was doing, because he used to be a free market kind of a guy, although he worked for the central bank, so might have lead a little bit more of less intervention in the economy. But if you work for a central bank, sorry, you're not an actual free market guy, no matter how many people try to put forth that pretense, right? Let me help. To put what's happening in Canada in context, let's first look at the U.S. following one of the biggest stock market bubbles ever in the early 2000s. The Federal Reserve, led by Alan Greenspan, feared that a crash-induced loss of confidence could lead to a serious recession or even a depression. I was a trader at the time. The mood was apocalyptic. But the actual recession in terms of the real economy, in quotations, the real economy, because you can remember, stock markets and governments aren't a reflection of the genuine real economy, turned out to be quite mild. Gross domestic product went negative, but not for consecutive quarters, so it didn't even meet the technical definition of a recession. Then a strong recovery began. So that's market fundamentals trying to work themselves out, right? Greenspan engineered an epic monetary policy response to a downturn by cutting interest rates from 6.5% at the end of 2000 to 1% in 2003 and leaving them there until mid-2004, even though by that point it was clear that the recession was over and the recovery had begun. When the Fed did begin to raise rates, it was only at a pace that was measured, in quotations, which turned out to be a quarter of a percentage point at a time. Look, dozens of books have been written about the financial crisis, and there was a confluence of factors that contributed to it. But too easy monetary policy allowed a stock market bubble to morph into a housing bubble, right? Investors will find some way. Speculators, market manipulators, they're going to look to some Ponzi scheme in some way, right? This is where free market fundamentals always kick in. It's like, you don't let these market speculators, let these fucking gamblers do their thing, but let them all be held to account for what they're doing, because it ain't just them. They're not sitting at a poker table with their own money. You know what I mean? If they were, then who gives a fuck? But when you're talking about this kind of stuff that has real world effects and ramifications for the population at large, central planning destroys, like I say, natural incentive is natural fundamentals as far as markets and economics goes. In economics, it can sometimes be difficult to determine causation. This is easy. Now, the financial crisis was pretty awful, leading to millions of job losses and political upheaval that continues to this day. One would think that as a central banker in country A, if you witnessed this in country B, you would do everything in your power to avoid it. One would think, right? But like I say, no one wants to rip the Band-Aid off. These fuckers, they got no courage, no character, no convictions. They would just want to go along to get along with everybody. And if you try that stuff, well, like I say, it's a race to the lowest common denominator. It's a race to the bottom that no one actually ends up winning. Matter of fact, if you're in water, you'd all drown, right? That race to the bottom's not going to work out too well for, well, I mean, except for a very few exceptions. Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada during the financial crisis and widely viewed as being a star central banker, eventually hired away to run the Bank of England. Carney cut interest rates early and often leading up to the financial crisis, including a surprise 50 basis points reduction to 3.50% in March of 2008, shortly after taking office. He recognized the severity of the crisis early on and took decisive action when others believed that subprime was contained. Carney eventually cut rates to 25 basis points in 2009 and started a policy of conditional commitment, meaning that the Bank of Canada would keep rates at the zero lower bound conditional on inflation for at least a year. Everyone understood that inflation wasn't going up, so this had the effect of lowering yields on bonds with longer maturities. Carney, perhaps so if bonds aren't, which would be like investing on human labor and capital of the sheeple, if that's not going to pay out enough to sustain this world of fractional reserve banking where you have to constantly keep GDP growth and all this shit, well, yeah, you're going to look to more dangerous and more less secure aspects of the economy to speculate on, right? Carney, perhaps even more than former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, was an excellent crisis central banker. Unfortunately, he did not nail the dismount, right? That's the problem with these people. When you you're not going to find any human beings that are perfect, and when they fuck up, it's not just that they will cause harm for themselves. It has massive intended and unintended consequences that can ramp up to the point where, if you don't look at history, you can have fucking wars where millions of people die as a result of these kind of decisions, as a result of central bank and central planners. That's why the invisible hand, people like Adam Smith, that's why market fundamentals and market forces should be the basis for all human interactions when you're talking about economics or even social activities. After it became clear in 2010 that the developed world had exited the financial crisis, Carney raised just a little to 1% and then left them there until 2013 when he joined the Bank of England. It is true the other central banks never got off zero bound at all, but Canada's recession was shallower and the recovery stronger. It has now been almost 9 years since the overnight rate was last above 1%. You can guess what happened next. A long period of negative real interest rates that led to an enormous misallocation of capital, again in residential real estate. A few years later, a huge housing bubble, the same exact mistake as Greenspan. So like I say, these central planners have what they did is there's market speculators because of cronyism flourishes and is allowed to exist because of collectivism and globalism. Well, if you shut off one avenue for them to speculate in markets and central plan and control where they can manipulate things, well, they'll just turn to somewhere else. And the housing market is where if it's not on the stock market, it's not in the bond market, well, as we're seeing now, well, hey, the housing market seems like a fucking right place to start that because no one was paying attention prior, right? Now we're going to jump into the fray, but look at how many people are fucking being hurted and hindered. And not just socially and economically, but even in demographic wise, it's about starting and having families and having kids. I mean, it has long-standing and substantial ramifications in so many aspects of people's lives. It's the same exact mistake as Greenspan. So yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to read one more paragraph here. This is a little frustrating for central bank watchers like me. The conventional wisdom that if you leave rates too low for too long, it leads to inflation in the price of goods and services. This would happen in the 1970s, but it's not what has happened. But is not what has happened today. Lately, long periods of negative real interest rates haven't led to goods inflation. It has led to asset price inflation in stocks, bonds, and housing. So perhaps a different framework is needed for central bankers. So like I say, they just move around where you, because with fractional reserve banking and all this kind of fiat currencies, the kind of world that we live under, they always have to find a way to keep the economy growing, even if it's fake, even if it's based on speculative wealth. So once again, natural market fundamentals and market forces and holding people to account and personal responsible, is the way that you weed this stuff out and hold everyone to account. That's the beautiful thing about the invisible hand that a lot of people don't understand. The invisible hand is the one underlying market fundamental because nobody knows which way it goes, right? There's no way that you can point from A to B, so everyone has to be on the best behavior because you don't know how it's going to react. That's the beautiful aspect of the free market. My suggestion is start with Adam Smith and go from there if you want to understand macroeconomics and fundamentals as far as central planning into the economies. But like I say, I'll post a link to this article, which I think is great. It was very well written, very well articulated, and I agree a whole lot with what this gentleman has to say. I'll post that in the description of the video below so you can continue on. I actually think there's only probably a few paragraphs left. Yeah, 2-3 paragraphs left. But continue on and read this. And pay attention to what's being said. Listen to the nuances that are being suggested here. It's all about, just like with you if you were raising kids, if you give everyone too much without holding them to account and responsibility, look at how they turn out. Or if you're too vicious and too over authoritarian and not allow them any freedoms, it always comes back to a proper center middle ground where everybody has to be held personally responsible and accountable for their decisions, right, that they make. That's the basis. That's the beautiful part. That's the invisible hand at work. This is the Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.